Hello everyone, this is Kelly Hampton, and I'm pleased to share with you an excerpt from Chapter 6, Archangel Michael's latest book shared with me, the third book, the Book of Animals. This chapter is entitled Wild Animals, to give you a sense of the teaching from Archangel Michael, my most recent release in 2016. By definition, wild animals are animals that have never been caged, never been tamed, never been under a microscope, never been impounded for scientific study or tagged. By this definition, there are less than 5% of the total animal population which accounts for this definition. If we choose to widen our examination of wild animals to include those who have been studied by scientists, then that percentage rises to 20%. Perhaps this percentage is a telling statement in itself, Archangel Michael explained, that as long as there have been animals on your planet, there have been those interested in their habits. In a brief examination in a text such as this, there are 5 main wild animal categories that I would like to share at this time. They are hyenas and jackals, big cats, elephants, rhinoceros and hippos, monkeys and apes, and the final category are wild mustangs. Michael continues, I almost stated man, but finding more hope and light in how man is respecting wildlife than mankind did 100, 200, and 1,000 years ago. Nevertheless, one cannot present a book of animals without speaking at length about the responsibility future generations play in the saving of many species. Even this generation, if you are listening to these words, you have an obligation to honor wildlife, all forms of life. Let us move now to a time in the way distant past when man and animals lived in harmony. There was such a time on your planet. It was called the Paleozoic time. During this time, all animals were wild, and there were no known threats except among each other. During this time, thousands and thousands of animals roamed freely about. In many ways, it was a time of nirvana. However, at the same time, all this free roaming about led to a time of chaos. Out of this chaos, order was born. It was born slowly, but nevertheless, it was birthed by what scientists call evolution. I will call God's plan. It was here that animals began to naturally separate themselves into what are commonly known as herds or groups or pods. During this process of natural selection, the earliest forms of the species I've listed here for examination were distant cousins of the same animal species that you may see today. This is because through a process I am calling natural maturation, some wild animals simply ceased to be here. It was their choosing, no one else's. They did not fall prey to man or climatary change. This resulted in another huge shift of vibration on your planet. This shift, where many early wild animals chose not to reincarnate and return, or chose to leave the plane of life, was referred to in my world as a planetary rift. And it was an energetic rift, much like a tidal wave, when dozens and dozens of early wild species on Earth decided collectively never to leave and never to return. Some were here as star seeds from other dimensions and left. Some simply chose to reincarnate as human beings instead, and some early wild animal souls did not incarnate at all. As Michael shares, he says, I had nothing to do with this event. It was an event which lasted about 350 years on our Earth. It resulted temporarily in things being out of balance. If you can imagine 2 people sitting on a teeter-totter, as children may do, and one child suddenly gets up, that's what happens to the other child. They become unbalanced and may even fall off. This is what it was like for about 350 years on Earth when a mass exodus of wild animals left at once. Collectively, it was as if 350 earthly years were condensed by a time warp of about 3 days. This is the way to think about the revolution. Hieroglyphic representations of wild animals are a wonderful study. The word hieroglyphic, by the way, comes from ancient Greek writings scripts, some of which are pictographs, and the word refers to a hieroglyphic script. Many of the old civilizations have recorded hieroglyphics. So, pertaining to the animals, the angel continued and said, many samples of pre-recorded categorizing of many animals in their simplest form were remembered in this way, and the study of these pictograph representations of very early wild animals is known as cartography. Why am I explaining this to you, he asked. Because wild animals were often falsely represented or drawn in some of the hieroglyphics. Why was this done, and who did this? The same dark forces that have worked to keep your planet under their control also manipulated some of the earliest recorded history of wild animals for one purpose and one purpose only, to diminish them. By falsifying very early documents when the written word was first being recorded was a means to an end. The end again was to diminish wild animals and alter their DNA structure to become beasts of burden without any emotion. These dark forces were successful to a large degree, but not completely. This is seldom, if ever, spoken of in literature. I have witnessed only one document which proclaimed these truths, and it was hidden away for centuries upon centuries. Once the formula for decoding God's original script for wild animals was underway, it became easier for those outside of light to manipulate them, to weaken them, and thus become less than their original creation. Now I have stated the worst of the worst. If you can imagine the early wild animals all totaled as threads of a large tapestry, and in their original glory they were strong, vibrant, thick, and then one day the threads became tattered and frayed at the ends. This is what it looked like to us for thousands of years. Species that were source, created to not have a weakness, suddenly had them. Species which were never intended to carry disease now carried and spread disease. This is how the thinning threads of an altered DNA lived for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. Wild animals were originally created without sin, meaning that they were to live and be pure love. No fighting within a species, no fighting outside of a species. Now let us advance in time to the Revolutionary War in North America. Before I get to this, you may be thinking that I'm never going to direct you and discuss directly hyenas and jackals. Let me assure you that I am leading up to this. What does the Revolutionary War have to do in a chapter discussing wild animals, the angel asked. He responded, everything, absolutely everything. You see, or should I say, did you know that the underground tunnels we spoke about in the earlier part of this text also existed under North America? When it was time for the soldiers to prepare for battle, they found themselves startled by large animals they had not seen before. This was not the first time, however, that large wild animals seemingly appeared out of nowhere. Many times in your Earth's history, war stories included men seeing large hairy animals of all descriptions, and their stories were discarded as insanity. Suffering the effects of war, many said. In England during the 100 Years' War, in Malaysia during their early feuds, in countries long before countries were divided, large wild animals would seemingly appear out of nowhere and then suddenly seemingly disappear. The seemingly unrelated occurrences during wartime occurred over large expanses of time on your planet, have largely gone undocumented or dismissed, as anyone recalling these sightings were again called lunatics or affected of the mind in one way or another. By the time in your history that the Revolutionary War had ended, dozens and dozens and dozens of sightings of wild hairy animals went unreported for fear of hospitalization or worse. Many of the descriptions across continents over time were the same. Quote, it was a large, hairy, ran on four legs fast, and menacing-looking type of some animal. What's largely the description. Yet they were all describing the very first hyena or jackal. You see, where you find wild animals inhabiting now is in no way where they inhabited your planet at creation or during the centuries since. Vast waves of migration took place. Many can imagine thousands of bison roaming the plains. This is the same type of vision which existed within all the large wild animals. The original population of wild land animals outnumbered man 5 to 1. If your minds were thinking that we would be locating our thoughts to the African continent to explore hyenas and jackals, the majesty in sharing is surprise. Hyenas and jackals first roamed the lands where Scotland and Ireland now exist, along with North America. It wasn't until much later that they repopulated and came to inhabit their present location in the central region of the African continent. Michael continues, I realize that in attempting to cover millions of years with this example of the hyena, all of the animals on your planet inhabited other places long ago. If you imagine a jigsaw puzzle with the pieces representing Earth and you scrambled them all around, that is what the habitations of wild animal life was like. Hyenas are some of the least loved wild animals on the planet. That is partially why I chose to share them here, so that all wild animals can be appreciated in one form or another. They have had to find new sources of food over the last 300 years, and their means for finding it has become dramatically more aggressive than the earlier hyena. While their conservation status may not be much of concern greatly, the stress level collectively within the species has risen dramatically as a result of encroaching natural habitation and other threats upon the species. The spotted hyena has an extensive vocal range and is able to growl, grunt, chortle, chuckle, yip,